Okay. Well, thanks, Jay. That was awesome. Anyway, so I guess I bet most of you have a regular morning routine. Maybe it's like Jill's. Maybe you wake up in the morning and have a beer. I don't know. No. But actually, you know, maybe you wake up for breakfast, you sit down, you have a cup of coffee, maybe a bowl of Cheerios, and you flip through the newspaper and you look at the headlines. But pretend for a moment that one morning, instead of sitting in your kitchen, let me just pull this out. Instead of sitting in your kitchen, you're sitting in the day room of your local county jail, surrounded by 40 other incarcerated men. As you sit down for a nice big bowl of stale Cheerios and a tiny little carton of milk, you glance over at the front page of the newspaper, and the first headline you see says, "Drug bust nets large haul. Police find cocaine, methamphetamine, and Viagra." Oh, and right underneath that headline is a picture of your smiling mugshot. Welcome to one of the lowest points of my life. Excuse me. Not only was I in jail after having spent the previous few years tweaked out of my mind, but my face was now plastered all over my local newspaper for everyone in the world I knew, or so everyone in the world I knew could see. And the word Viagra was in bold right above my picture. Needless to say, I'm going to tell you some stories about gutters. And as a quick aside, let me just point out that meth is a hell of a drug, and it wreaks havoc on your physiology. So yeah, Viagra. Anyway. So the word Viagra has several meanings, and I'm going to talk about a few of them. The first, and perhaps the most common, is in the phrase, "in the gutter." So I knew my life was in the gutter when I heard the jury's verdict come back. On the count of first-degree possession, we find the defendant guilty. I was in total shock because I knew that that meant a lot of prison time. When I got back to jail, I walked straight into my cell, and I didn't leave for days. I didn't eat, I didn't shower, I didn't talk to anybody. I just sat there in my cell alone. And I'm not going to lie, I cried more than I've ever cried in my life. And all I could think about was how I had been nothing but a disappointment to my family, and whether or not life was actually worth living. But then a friend came up to my cell and knocked on the door. And he tried to coax me out for lunch. I sat there for a few minutes, looked at as I stared at the ceiling, and eventually I came out. And I sat next to him at the lunch table. He looked at me across the table and he said something that always stuck with me. He said, "You know what, this sucks, but there's nothing you can do about it, so you might as well make the best of it." And he was right. I had no control of where I would spend the next few years, but I did have control how I would spend the next few years. Things happen in our lives, but it's up to us how we deal with them. So that brings me to my second definition of gutter. I saw many of us are here for Law and Society, so I'm assuming many of us write articles or whatever, and maybe some books. So this might be familiar. So you know when you open a book, and on the one page, on each page, there's a block of text, right? Well, that space that's in the middle of those pages is called the gutter margin. So while I was sitting at that lunch table, I'd begun moving from one page of my life to the next. In other words, I was crossing over the gutter. Right? Come on, I thought that was super clever. So, for me, this took the form of learning about myself and about life. First, I learned that everything is temporary. Practically speaking, prison life was the epitome of temporary. For example, people are always getting moved around, they're always getting transferred to new prisons, so it's difficult to ever get comfortable, so I was able to keep myself moving forward. It's how I kept myself focused and driven toward my goals, which I actually had begun setting for myself for the first time in my life. But on a more psychological level, I realized that no matter how bad things are or how bad they seemed, that it was only temporary. Am I talking too loud? Okay. I've been accused of that. This is a 180-degree shift from my attitude before prison, and it's something I've taken with me ever since, because it's granted me perspective and peace of mind. And frankly, bad stuff is going to happen, right? So I can either focus on how bad it is, or I can focus on the positives, right? And move on. Now, the second thing I learned was how we need other people. Before prison, I was very independent. I didn't trust people. And if I was smoking meth like every day. So if you've seen Breaking Bad, you know that trust is not in huge supply in the meth world. And I also pushed away my family and friends. But in prison, I was lucky enough to have the opportunity to rebuild those relationships with my parents and with my brother. And I have absolutely no doubt that my post-prison success has been due in large part to their unwavering support. In prison, I worked as an education tutor with guys preparing for their GED. So I saw firsthand how devastating a lack of support can be. I worked a lot with a guy named Steven. We spent a lot of time working on basic math, multiplication, division, things like that. He was in his early 30s, and he was a very successful drug dealer. Well, successful until he got busted. Because we were in the same early release program, we were going to be released at the same day. And as our day would get closer, Steven would tell me more and more about how worried he was, because he would have to go back to his old neighborhood, the same neighborhood where he used to hustle. And he didn't have anyone there. But I didn't actually understand how worried he was until 17 days before our release. He decided that he wanted to quit the program because he didn't have anybody outside. He had no support. In other words, he chose 3.5 years more prison so he wouldn't be thrown back into the streets with no one to count on. My experiences with Steven, similar to Jay and with many others, are what drove me toward where I am now, working on my Ph.D. at the U of M, researching the effects of prison and punishment in society. They are what pushed me to recognize that although agency plays a role, the relative lack of opportunities and abundance of barriers are incredibly important too. And speaking of opportunities, prison is where I learned about the last definition of gutter that I'm going to talk about. In prison, a gutter is also synonymous with a small homemade prison knife or a shiv. So it's got usually a little hook to it. And what you do is you stab a guy in the side of the stomach, and then you tear sideways, and then you reach with your other hand and pull their guts out and throw them on the ground. Now, the guy who told me this, in the very next breath, asked me if I had heard the good news while he was holding a Bible. So, you learn things in weird ways. Now, I didn't get stabbed in prison, nor did I stab anybody. But I did play a lot of poker with a guy who was in for murder. And one day he decided to tell me his story. Basically, he'd come home really drunk and got into a fight with his roommate. He ended up beating him to death. Well, in his drunken panic, he wanted to get rid of the body. So he tried to get him into the trunk of the car. It wouldn't fit. So he dragged him into the garage and pulled out a Sawzall and cut off his arms and his legs and his head. And then drove him out to the country and buried him. At this point in the story, he came down and he stood right above me. And he said, "Stewart, if you don't learn anything else in this experience, make sure you remember this. If you ever kill someone and have to get rid of the body, bury them at least 4 feet underground or the canine will find them." So now I share that little piece of wisdom with you. We continued to play poker after that, but needless to say, his winning percentage went way up. But thankfully, I'll never have to heed that advice because my gutter experiences brought me here in front of you today. Now I eat my Cheerios in the morning, just like everybody else, surrounded by supportive people. There are still headlines about me, but now they're about my advocacy and my activism. And I know that I can affect positive change because nothing is ever as bad as it seems. And because of that, my own winning percentage has gone up. Thanks.